Grimlord is, for a bunch of reasons, the ideal game for the masochists among you, which makes sense given that Dark Souls inspired this VR game. And it does deliver on the hardcore aesthetic. Well, kinda. Let's dive into this review of Grimlord, starting with what this game actually is. The developers have crafted a world that has depth, but it doesn't always feel that way. Let me explain. You awaken in a cell, stepping into the role of an adventurer destined to battle the Grimlord. He's an evil king that has done a lot of evil things evilly. It's a strong premise for sure, but the game struggles to make you truly embody that role. There are some enjoyable aspects about this game that we'll get into later, but when it comes to the theme, while there's lore sprinkled throughout, it often feels like it exists just to make your struggle make sense, as opposed to drawing you into the game. You're here to fight and push forward because that's what the game demands, not necessarily because the world itself compels you. That being said, Grimlord definitely nails the difficulty of a Souls-like game. Even after getting comfortable in combat, I found myself getting deleted over and over again. This world might not always feel rich with story, but it definitely feels hostile. Speaking of hostile, Grimlord's mechanics are a mix of fun when they work and frustration when they don't. Again, this is a Souls-like game, so combat is tough by design, but the execution isn't as polished as it should be. Let's start with the good because combat feels great in this game. When you land a hit, there's a solid sense of impact, and the same goes for when you take damage. Hits hurt, and if you aren't used to Souls-like games, you'll quickly learn that recklessness gets you deleted fast. I'll also give ranged combat some praise here because it doesn't feel as chaotic as it does in other VR games. Landing a headshot gives you satisfying feedback, making bows a fun and viable choice when you need to thin out unarmored enemies from a distance. And the magic is immersively implemented too. Instead of just pressing a button, you cast spells by tracing patterns, which is the kind of thing that can only be realized in a headset and makes the whole experience feel more interactive and immersive. Beyond combat itself though, and even sometimes during combat, you might run into an annoyance or two. Swing your weapon too fast and they can clip right through each other. Also, sometimes what should be a solid hit just doesn't register as such, making fights feel unpredictable in ways it shouldn't. Moving into Grimlord's crafting system, it's definitely unique if nothing else. Instead of a boring menu, you cycle through a rotating weapons parts catalog, which sounds cool in theory. In practice, it feels awkward to turn. My first attempt at crafting had me accidentally auto-creating the first thing I turned to, simply because I already had the materials for it. Now, I was able to immediately smelt it back down and get my components back, but it was still annoying. Then we have inventory management, which in general is a weak spot for this game. Pulling out and storing weapons doesn't always feel natural and often doesn't work, causing you to drop your weapons on the ground. And problems like this persist with items like potions being more of a struggle to use than they should be. Just trying to open a potion bottle sometimes turned into a mini boss fight of its own with how inconsistent the grab points felt. In terms of the mechanics, Grimlord has received 3 patches since launch, yet it still feels like it's in beta. There's a solid foundation here, but the rough edges are impossible to ignore. It's a shame because when the mechanics work, the combat is engaging and some of the best close combat in VR to date. Speaking of mixed bags, Grimlord wants to pull you into its dark fantasy world, but the graphics, at least on standalone, make that a bit harder than it should be. This is the kind of game where atmosphere is everything, and while you can tell the developers care about that, the visuals don't always do their job translating that care. Again, let's start with the good, and again, it's the NPCs because they actually look great. They have impressive level of detail, and their movements feel natural, which is a big deal for me in VR. I like for human things to move like humans. And yourself included, you can even manipulate body parts in ways that are weird for different reasons than usual.
Okay, that's nasty.
But then there's everything else. The environment is simply all over the place. Some areas look okay while others barely get a passing grade for me. Now, mediocre textures aren't the end of the world and graphics aren't everything, but there are areas right next to each other with glaring differences in visual quality. Certain details that should add to the world's immersion simply don't stand out in a good way. This wouldn't be as big a problem in a title with a smaller focus on quality graphics, but in a Souls-like game, atmosphere is massive. The world should feel as oppressive and eerie as the gameplay. Instead, it's not hard to notice the graphical inconsistencies breaking that immersion. The effort is there, and on a subconscious level you can feel what the game is going for, but visually it just doesn't deliver the way it needs to. The audio shares a similar vibe with the graphics, but better for sure. There are moments where the sound design really adds to the experience, and others where it feels completely out of place. Take the intro video for example. I had already turned down the music volume in the settings before starting, but when the cutscene played it completely ignored that change. The result was an intro that came off uncomfortably loud. And it doesn't help that whoever voiced the intro came off as forced, and his voice simply felt out of place.
The first blood march turned brothers against brothers, cathedrals into slaughterhouses, men.
If the goal was to make an impact, it definitely did, but probably not as intended. That said, the NPC dialogue is easily the best part of the audio experience. Their dialogues are natural, the delivery is solid, and the vibe makes it easy to believe these characters exist in this world. At times, it almost felt like I was listening to a real person legitimately trying to ruin my day with their tragic backstory. As with other aspects of this game, the NPCs once again steal the show. The combat sounds, on the other hand, can be a bit too much. Weapon clashes have a nice impact, but they sound overly dramatic. A lot like smashing a car into a microphone hidden inside a giant suit of plate armor. Blocking and parrying are satisfying, but the exaggerated sounds can pull you out of the moment. The environmental sounds here also miss the mark. For example, standing deep inside a fortress and hearing wind howling as if you were already outside. Now, the idea of hearing the wind in the distance could add to the immersion, if it wasn't so loud that it made the whole place feel as if I was in the middle of a blizzard. To be clear, the audio here isn't terrible, but much like the visuals, it struggles with balance. There are areas where the sound design enhances the experience, but just as many where it pulls you out of it. As for the options, it's probably the weakest category for this game. The UI itself feels pretty uninspired. Not terrible, just uninspired. Thankfully, the actual settings give you some solid customization options to tweak the experience to your liking. For starters, there is a vignette setting which is nice for reducing motion sickness. It may not have an intensity slider, but it's nice to have this at all. You also get the choice between a more convenient UI or a fully immersive one, letting you decide how much you want the game to feel like it's really throwing you to the wolves. One standout option here though is the ability to hide your body. This actually makes the game more playable for some people. And honestly, given how awkwardly your arms feel like they're near your neck instead of on your torso, hiding the body might be a better choice anyway. Beyond that, you get the usual height calibration, movement controls, and controller tuning options so you can fine-tune things to your preference. There are also a couple of cooler UI elements like being able to check your equipment stats by touching an item with two hands, and the teleporter statue doubling as a save point depending on which gems you crush in your hand. All that said, when you put these elements into one working game, you can tell Grimlord definitely wants to pull you into its dark, punishing world. Unfortunately, the experience just doesn't come together the way it should. Every aspect of the game has something promising, but also something that's holding it back. I'll flash the score on the screens for you here, but for these reasons, Grimlord walks away with an overall immersion score of 2.5 out of 6. That said, if you're looking for a challenging VR Souls-like title, there is fun to be had here, especially if you don't mind the rough edges. But if you want something more polished, you might want to wait and see if future updates brings this game up to where I feel it should be. What do you guys think though? Have you played Grimlord or are you waiting for it to improve? Let me know in the comments because I want to hear your thoughts, and please don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future VR gaming content. Thanks for watching, and until next time.
Oh my god, it glitched me out of the game.